couple weeks ago, as I was preparing for this exhibition, I was looking around semi-frantically for hardware to hang the paintings. And in the States or in Ireland where I used to live, it would have been a simple matter of popping into the hardware store, finding my D-rings, finding my picture wire. But it turns out in Spain, they hang pictures differently, and those things didn't exist. In spite of having lived in different countries, it continually surprises me how so many things are place and cultural dependent. So finally, I went to this huge hardware store in Barcelona, Serve Estacio, one of my favorite places. It's 7 floors of hardware. I traversed the place looking for something that would work, and finally found something I thought would work, went down to the checkout, a little mentally fatigued, a little frazzled, and right there at the checkout stand, they have this huge display of Toblerone chocolates. I had no intention of buying a Toblerone chocolate. I certainly didn't need to eat chocolate. I tried not to buy a Toblerone, and of course I ended up buying a Toblerone chocolate, not just for myself, but for my friend. And I guess in my defense, I can only say that the environment made me do it. So we like to think that we have free will, that we are making our own decisions in the world, but actually our environments, the places in which we were born, the places in which we find ourselves, the people who surround us, have a huge impact on our behaviors, on our decisions, and on who we become. Sometimes it's tiny things like buying a chocolate when you didn't intend to, but sometimes it can have much bigger ramifications. This painting here is called The Garden Makes Eve. Normally we think about the story of Eve as, oh, Eve, she made these really poor choices to the detriment of humanity. But if we look at it from the point of view of the environment and the impact the environment had, it tells a different story. You have Eve, a human who, like all humans, was curious, knowledge-seeking, maybe poor impulse control, and you place her in this environment full of things to explore, in particular this beautiful tree with beautiful fruit, and you specifically say, don't touch this fruit. So, whether you consider the story of Eve to be sort of the start of human enlightenment or the downfall of humans, it seemed inevitable that given that environment, Eve was going to eat the apple. And this topic, this relationship between people and their environments, is something that has interested me for a very long time. For a long time as an environmental psychologist, where I researched, for instance, the impact of environments on people's mental health. And now as a full-time artist, I'm still exploring these same themes. And that's really the basis for this exhibition, which is entitled Bound and Determined. And the title comes from this piece in the corner, Bound and Determined. This figure, you can see, is part of her environment. She's intertwined in her environment. So she is, in a sense, constrained by her environment, but yet she's looking very regal. It's almost like the structure that she sits upon is kind of a throne. And this interaction between people and their environments, and particularly the tension that I see between how environments, our surroundings, the places we live in, the people around us, how on the one hand they can provide a huge source of support. They can lift us up, they can hold us, give us structure. But on the other hand, those very same environments and people can be constraining. They can bind us, they can hold us back. It's this layering and this tension that I find really interesting. This figure is separate from her environment, and yet she is part of it. She's clearly constructed with and out of her environment. She's defined by it to some extent. Definition and redefinition is also an interesting theme. Sometimes we talk about, oh, you've redefined yourself. Some people may say, oh, you've redefined yourself now as an artist. And I don't think of it like that. I think we never overwrite what we were before. We never completely redefine ourselves. Instead, we're sort of in a process of continually defining who we are. So my role as as daughter, as sister gets layered with my role as independent college student or as partner, as lover, as mother. Those roles are layered, and I become who I am through my own intentions, but also in part through what the environment and other people ask of me or require me to do. These are the kind of ideas I like to play with, very abstract ideas, and part of the struggle and joy for me, I think this is true of many artists, is figuring out how to bring these sort of abstract ideas to life through flat art. It's grabbing these ideas and somehow flattening them on paper and depicting them in a way that says what I want them to say in a way that maybe words can't even say. Part of the way I do that is through the process itself, my artistic process. I use a lot of layers. I start with something, often collage or mark making. I layer with oil paint. I scrape back into that. I layer more, and it's this back and forth, this constant defining and redefining, until I end up with something that I feel says what I'm trying to say. It sort of speaks to me, but it also shows the history of its making. So you can see little bits of the layers that have come before, little bits of collage or marks poking through that give a sense of the history and the experience of the figures in this piece. The other thing that inspires this body of work is the metaphor of construction itself. I think of these figures or our lives as being constructed. And I'm really inspired here in Barcelona by construction scenes that you see all over. The buildings that are torn out in the middle of terraces, the remnants where you can see what used to be there. And I borrowed heavily from that metaphor, and I've used the idea of scaffolding and netting that you might find in construction sites, and I've abstracted those, incorporated them into a lot of these pieces. The color palette itself also comes from these construction sites, so it's a lot of muted earth colors with these occasional pops of brighter colors, like you'd see like a construction cone or a blue tarp. This piece brings together a lot of the themes that I'm talking about. This is a self-portrait. You can see that I've referenced scaffolding quite a bit in this theme, both in sort of the collage work underneath and some of the mark making on top and the different layers. The palette is this very muted palette of construction with some of these brighter colors popping through. A lot of people say, oh, that doesn't look anything like you, that can't be a self-portrait. But like most of my work, I start with something. I always start with some reference outside of myself, something to respond to, but that gets dropped at some point as I start responding more and more to whatever's happening on the canvas. So this started out referencing myself in the mirror, but as I worked on this piece, that sort of literal image of me got lost. But I think it really does depict how I was feeling at that time. So this was done in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. It's called Self-Portrait La Cuarentena. It was in the middle of the quarantine here in Barcelona. And, on the one hand, I felt very lucky to be here in Barcelona. I had great faith in the healthcare system. In general, people trust the healthcare system here. I felt like the government was trying to do its best with the limited information we had to keep us safe, that the policies they were putting in place made sense at the time. I felt like we would eventually get the vaccine. So the whole cultural and governmental environment, I felt like was giving me good structure to keep me safe. But at the same time, that very same structure was really constraining. We basically couldn't leave our apartments for a very long time. There were so many things we couldn't do, and I felt very trapped, like I was losing time. So it really, for me, this really captures that tension I was feeling between being supported by my environment on the one hand, but also by being really constrained by it. There was an older Catalan woman who came into the gallery a couple days ago, and she took a look around and she said, "Oh, tragedy." And she kind of went around and looked at the pieces, and then she stopped in one piece and turned to me and she said, "This one is my favorite." And I said, "Oh, what is it you see in that piece?" And she said, "There's less tragedy in this piece." And I thought that was interesting, even though tragedy is not my intent, but it's very interesting to me to see how people respond to the work. And I have, my intentions and where the work comes from for me, but people bring their own history, their own experience to the work, and that is the lens through which they see it. For me, this work isn't tragic, and it doesn't come from a dark place, even though other people will say, "Oh, this work is very dark." For me, it's really more about resilience. It's this idea that, yes, we are sometimes limited and constrained and certainly affected by the places in which we live. But on the other hand, we are resilient. We can use those places and work with them to become who we want to be. In a sense, we can construct ourselves. So that, for me, is what this work is about. We are bound by our environments, but we are determined in ourselves. Bound and determined. I really want to thank Flash Gallery for inviting me to show in this beautiful space. The galleryist and architect David Correa remade this space from an old shop, and I just couldn't think of a better place to show this body of work. There's a sense of history and of layering in the space itself. It's the walls with the new floors. It was his interest in the history and of combining that and layering that into something new, which I think thematically works so well with this work, and I think the color scheme works so well with this work. The shop that used to be here was a birdcage shop, and I love that metaphor also related to this body of work. So a cage is something that on the one hand can keep us safe, give us structure. On the other hand, it can be limiting and containing. So I love that metaphor of this space also for this body of work. Thanks everybody for coming and having a look around and for listening to me talk about my work. For me as an artist, this completes the circle to be able to share the work and to watch people react to it. Super satisfying. So thank you.